Welcome to our channel, where we explore the most intriguing stories of love, loss, and redemption. Today, we have a tale that will tug at your heartstrings and keep you on the edge of your seat. Imagine believing the love of your life is gone forever, only to stumble upon her image in the most unexpected place, a magazine cover. Join us as we dive into the world of Harold Thompson, a man who thought he was a widower until a single photograph turned his entire life upside down. As he unravels the mystery of his wife's disappearance, Harold's journey will take him across continents and deep into the recesses of his own heart. Get ready for a story filled with shocking twists, emotional reunions, and a search for truth that will leave you questioning what you would do in Harold's shoes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy, because this story is about to begin. Harold Thompson's life had become a series of quiet routines. Every morning, he would sit at the same small kitchen table, sipping his black coffee while staring out the window, his thoughts inevitably drifting back to Eleanor. It had been 5 long years since the accident, but the emptiness in his heart hadn't dulled. His world had grown smaller, filled with memories of a love he believed was lost forever. That day, as Harold sat in the doctor's waiting room, flipping through a magazine he had no real interest in, something caught his eye. He stopped, his breath hitching in his throat. There, on the glossy page, was a woman who looked exactly like Eleanor. His Eleanor. She was smiling, radiant, her eyes crinkling at the corners just as he remembered. But the caption read, "Helen Porter, Life in Italy," and it spoke of a vibrant life in Florence, far removed from the quiet town in New York where they had built their life together. Harold's heart pounded as he stared at the image, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Could it be a coincidence? A mere look-alike? Or was this somehow his Eleanor, alive and well, living under a different name in a foreign land? The possibility ignited a spark within him, something that had been dormant since the day he buried her. When he returned home, the magazine tucked under his arm, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to know more. He laid the magazine on the coffee table, his mind racing with questions. Who was this Helen Porter? And if she truly was Eleanor, why had she left? Why had she let him believe she was dead? With trembling hands, Harold opened his laptop and began researching. Hours passed as he pieced together the fragments of Helen Porter's life. She had indeed lived in Italy for years, working in the art world, seemingly oblivious to the life she had left behind in America. The more he read, the more convinced he became that this woman was not just a look-alike. This was Eleanor. By the time the sun began to set, Harold had made a decision. He could no longer sit by, haunted by the ghosts of what if. He needed to see her, to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He booked a flight to Florence, his heart heavy with anticipation and fear. As he packed his bags that evening, Harold couldn't help but wonder what he would find on the other side of the ocean. Would it be the reunion he longed for, or would he uncover a truth too unbearable to face? With a deep breath, he zipped up his suitcase, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Whatever awaited him in Florence, he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. Harold stepped off the plane and into the bustling world of Florence, a city full of life and color, so different from the quiet solitude he'd left behind in New York. The warm Italian sun shone brightly, casting a golden hue over the historic buildings, but Harold hardly noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Eleanor, or Helen as she was now known. The possibility that she was alive had rekindled a fire in him, but it was also a heavy burden, pulling him deeper into a sea of uncertainty. He checked into a modest hotel not far from the city center, a place recommended by a friend for its quiet charm. The room was simple, with a small balcony overlooking a cobblestone street lined with cafes and shops. Normally, Harold might have found it quaint, but today, it felt like just another stop on a journey that was anything but ordinary. After settling in, Harold ventured out into the city. Florence was as breathtaking as the postcards had promised, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He clutched the magazine tightly, its pages worn from constant handling, as he navigated the narrow streets. His first stop was the address of the gallery where Helen Porter supposedly worked. His heart pounded with each step, a mix of fear and anticipation gnawing at him. When Harold finally arrived, the gallery stood as an elegant, understated building nestled between larger, more imposing structures. The sign above the door was in Italian, but it was clear enough. This was the place. Harold hesitated for a moment, gathering his courage before stepping inside. The gallery's interior was cool and serene, the air filled with a faint scent of fresh flowers. Artwork of all kinds adorned the walls, modern pieces, classic portraits, and everything in between. A few patrons moved quietly from piece to piece, but Harold's eyes scanned the room for only one person. And then he saw her. She stood near the back, speaking softly with a customer. Her hair was shorter now, styled in a sleek bob, and she wore a tailored suit that accentuated her graceful figure. Harold's breath caught in his throat. It was Eleanor. No, it was Helen. She looked almost the same, yet different, as if time had reshaped her into someone he both knew and didn't know. Harold wanted to approach her, to call out her name, but fear held him back. What if she didn't recognize him? What if this woman truly believed she was someone else? He watched as she laughed softly at something the customer said, a sound he hadn't heard in years but still remembered with painful clarity. He turned away, feeling a sudden wave of doubt. Could this really be Eleanor? Or was he simply seeing what he wanted to see? Harold's resolve wavered, but he couldn't leave, not without knowing for sure. The customer eventually walked away, leaving Helen alone for a brief moment. Summoning all his courage, Harold took a step forward. As he approached, Helen looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a split second, Harold saw something in her expression, recognition, confusion, perhaps even fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Can I help you?" she asked in fluent English, her voice polite and professional. Harold opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to say her name, to tell her everything, but all he could manage was a shaky, "I'm sorry. I must have mistaken you for someone else." Helen smiled gently, nodding as if she'd heard this before. "It happens. Enjoy the gallery." Harold nodded numbly, turning away before his emotions could betray him. As he left the gallery, 1,000 questions swirled in his mind. Who was this woman? And if she was Eleanor, why didn't she recognize him? He had come all this way for answers, but now he only had more questions. Back in his hotel room, Harold sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the magazine cover that had brought him here. Florence had always been a city of beauty and art, but now it was a place of mystery and hidden truths. Harold knew he couldn't leave, not until he found out the real story behind the woman who looked so much like the love of his life. The days in Florence passed slowly for Harold. He spent hours wandering the city's streets, trying to summon the courage to approach Helen again. The city's charm was lost on him. His thoughts were consumed by the woman who looked so much like his lost love. Every time he recalled their brief encounter in the gallery, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had recognized him, even if only for a fleeting moment. But if she truly was Eleanor, why hadn't she said anything? On the fourth day, Harold found himself back at the gallery. This time, he lingered outside, watching through the large windows as Helen interacted with clients. She moved with a grace and confidence that was both familiar and foreign to him. Harold knew he couldn't continue like this, hovering on the edges of her life, afraid to dive in. He had to talk to her, to see if there was any part of her that remembered their life together. Taking a deep breath, Harold entered the gallery. Helen was at the far end, adjusting a painting on the wall. She glanced over her shoulder as the doorbell chimed, and her eyes locked onto Harold. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a slight nod, she acknowledged him, though her expression remained calm and unreadable. "Back again?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "Yes," Harold replied, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "I couldn't stay away. There's something about this place. And about you." Helen tilted her head slightly, a small frown creasing her brow. "I see. Do we know each other?" The question hung in the air between them. Harold swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind countless times, but now that it was happening, nothing seemed adequate. "I'm not sure," he finally said, "but I think we might have, once." Helen studied his face, her eyes narrowing as if searching for something familiar. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head. "I don't think so, but there is something about you. I can't quite place it." Harold felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a part of her that remembered. He decided to take a risk, to push just a little further. "You remind me of someone I knew, someone very dear to me." Helen's expression softened, a hint of sadness creeping into her eyes. "I'm sorry." "I wish I could say the same." As they stood there, the atmosphere between them heavy with unspoken thoughts, Helen suddenly winced, raising a hand to her temple. Harold stepped forward, concerned. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said quickly, but her voice was strained. "Just a headache, that's all." But it wasn't just a headache. As Harold watched, Helen's face contorted with confusion and pain. She pressed her fingers against her temples, her eyes squeezing shut as if trying to block out something overwhelming. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the moment passed, and she straightened up, though her expression remained troubled. Harold's concern deepened. "Maybe you should sit down." "I could." "No," Helen interrupted, shaking her head more forcefully this time. "I'm fine." "Really? It's just... sometimes I get these flashes, images, feelings. They don't make any sense." "What kind of flashes?" Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen hesitated, as if debating whether to reveal more. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter, more vulnerable. "They're like fragments of a life I don't remember living, places I've never been, faces I don't know, and yet they feel so real." Harold's heart raced. Could it be? Could these flashes be memories of their life together? He wanted to reach out, to tell her everything, but something held him back. What if he was wrong? What if these were just random thoughts, unrelated to Eleanor at all? Before he could say anything more, the door to the gallery opened, and a tall man with dark hair and a sharp, elegant suit stepped inside. Helen's entire demeanor shifted the moment she saw him. She straightened up, a polite smile replacing the troubled look on her face. "Giovanni," she said, her voice now controlled and calm. "I didn't expect you so early." Giovanni glanced at Harold, his eyes assessing him with quiet suspicion before turning his attention back to Helen. I thought I'd surprise you. We have that meeting with the clients this afternoon, remember? Yes, of course, Helen replied, her tone professional. I'll be ready. Harold felt a chill run down his spine as Giovanni turned back to him. His smile friendly, but his eyes cold. And you must be the gentleman who's been visiting our gallery so frequently. Can I help you with anything? Harold shook his head, forcing a polite smile. No, thank you. I was just admiring the artwork. Good, Giovanni said, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of warning. Enjoy your visit. Harold nodded and took a step back, feeling out of place and unwanted. As he turned to leave, he cast one last glance at Helen. She was watching him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite read. But there was something there, something that gave him hope. As he exited the gallery, Harold knew that whatever was happening to Helen, whatever these flashes were, they were a key to unlocking the truth, and he was determined to stay in Florence until he found out exactly what that truth was. Harold spent the next few days exploring Florence, but his mind was always on Helen and the flashes of memory she had described. He knew he was getting closer to the truth, but Giovanni's presence complicated everything. The man was clearly protective of Helen, and Harold couldn't shake the feeling that Giovanni was hiding something important. Determined to uncover what it was, Harold decided it was time to confront Giovanni directly. Late one afternoon, Harold returned to the gallery, hoping to catch Helen alone. Instead, he found Giovanni locking up for the day. The street was quiet, the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows on the cobblestones. Giovanni looked up as Harold approached, his expression neutral but guarded. Back again? Giovanni asked, his tone polite but with an edge. Yes, Harold replied, standing firm. I was hoping we could talk. Giovanni arched an eyebrow. About what? About Helen, Harold said, cutting to the chase. And about who she really is. Giovanni's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Harold thought he might just walk away. But then Giovanni sighed and gestured for Harold to follow him into a nearby cafe. Once inside, they found a secluded table in the back, away from prying ears. Giovanni ordered 2 espressos, though neither man seemed interested in drinking them. You seem very interested in Helen, Giovanni began, his voice measured. Why? Harold leaned forward, meeting Giovanni's gaze directly. Because I believe she's my wife. Giovanni's expression didn't change, but Harold noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. Your wife? Yes, Harold said, his voice unwavering. Her name is Eleanor Thompson, and she's been missing for 5 years. I thought she died in a car accident, but now I'm not so sure. Giovanni was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying Harold's face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm. Helen is not Eleanor. She's someone else, someone who has been through a lot. I found her after she'd suffered a terrible accident, and she had no memory of who she was. We built a life here together. Harold's heart sank, but he refused to give up. She's starting to remember, isn't she? Those flashes she mentioned, they're pieces of her old life. Our life. Giovanni's jaw tightened, and Harold knew he had hit a nerve. Whatever she's remembering, it doesn't matter. The past is the past. Helen has a new life now, and she's happy here. Harold shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves to make her own choice. And what if that choice destroys her? Giovanni countered, his voice rising slightly. Do you really want to put her through that? Harold hesitated, the weight of Giovanni's words pressing down on him. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. She's stronger than you think, Harold said softly, and she has a right to know who she really is. Giovanni stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked out of the cafe, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts and the untouched espressos. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. Giovanni's words echoed in his mind, filling him with doubt. But his resolve remained firm. Helen, Eleanor, needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and he was the only one who could give it to her. The next day, Harold returned to the gallery, but this time he didn't go inside. Instead, he waited outside, watching as Helen went about her day. When she finally left in the early evening, Harold followed her at a distance, determined to find the right moment to speak with her. As she walked through the narrow streets of Florence, the setting sun casting a warm glow on the ancient buildings, Helen seemed lost in thought. Harold quickened his pace, closing the distance between them. "Helen!" he called out, his voice steady. She stopped and turned, surprise flashing in her eyes as she saw him approaching. "Mr. Thompson, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Harold said, his voice firm but gentle. "About those flashes you've been having." Helen's expression darkened, and she glanced around as if looking for an escape. "I told you, they don't mean anything." "But they do," Harold insisted, stepping closer. "They're memories, Helen. Memories of a life you had before the accident." Helen's eyes widened slightly, but she shook her head. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Harold pressed on. "You just don't want to believe it. But it's the truth. You're not Helen Porter. You're Eleanor Thompson, my wife." Helen took a step back, her face pale, her eyes filling with confusion and fear. "No, that's not possible." Harold reached out, but she flinched away, holding up a hand to stop him. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "just leave me alone." But Harold couldn't. He knew he had to push through the fear, through the uncertainty. "I can't," he said softly, "because I love you, Eleanor. I've loved you all these years, and I never stopped believing that somehow you'd come back to me." Helen's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Harold thought she might crumble. But then she turned and ran, disappearing into the maze of Florence's streets. Harold stood frozen, watching her go, his heart breaking all over again. He didn't follow her. He knew she needed time, time to process, time to remember. But he also knew that the truth was out there now, and there was no going back. All he could do was wait and hope that, when the time was right, Eleanor would come back to him. Helen ran through the narrow streets of Florence, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of Harold's words echoing in her mind. "You're not Helen Porter. You're Eleanor Thompson, my wife." The claim was absurd, impossible even, but it had struck a chord deep within her. The flashes, the strange, fragmented memories, could they really be pieces of a life she had forgotten? She didn't stop running until she reached the Arno River, its calm waters a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. Gasping for breath, Helen leaned against the stone wall, trying to make sense of the storm of emotions swirling within her. How could she be someone else? How could she have lived an entire life before Florence, one she had no recollection of? As she stared at her reflection in the river, Helen's mind raced. She had always felt there were pieces missing, shadows of something just out of reach. But she had never questioned it too deeply. Giovanni had been her anchor, helping her build a new life from the ashes of the accident. Now, The certainty she had clung to for years was crumbling, leaving her adrift in a sea of doubt. By the time she returned to her apartment, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the city. Giovanni was waiting for her, a concerned expression on his face. "Helen, where have you been? I've been worried sick." Helen avoided his gaze, her mind still reeling. "I just needed some air." Giovanni stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. "Did you see him again? That man, Harold?" Helen nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "He told me things, Giovanni. Things that don't make any sense. But they feel true." Giovanni's expression hardened, and he reached out, gently taking her hands in his. "Helen, listen to me. Whatever he told you, it doesn't matter. Your life is here, with me, in Florence. You've built something beautiful here. Don't let a stranger's words tear that apart." Helen looked into Giovanni's eyes, seeing the love and concern there. He had always been there for her, always supported her. But now, those feelings were tangled with doubt and confusion. She pulled her hands away, pacing the room as she tried to process everything. "But what if he's right?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if I'm really Eleanor? What if I had a whole life before this?" Giovanni's jaw clenched, and he took a deep breath before speaking. "Helen, even if that's true, even if you were someone else before, it doesn't change what we have now. The past is gone. What matters is the life we've built together." Helen stopped pacing, her eyes filled with tears. "But how can I ignore it? How can I pretend that those memories don't exist? I need to know who I really am, Giovanni. I need to find out the truth." Giovanni's expression softened, but there was a hint of desperation in his voice. "And what if the truth only brings you pain? What if it takes you away from everything we've built?" Helen shook her head, her heart aching with the weight of the decision she knew she had to make. "I don't know. But I can't live like this, with pieces of my past missing. I need to understand. I need to remember." Giovanni stepped closer, his voice pleading. "Helen, please. Don't do this. Don't let him take you away from me." Helen's resolve wavered, but she knew in her heart that she couldn't ignore the truth any longer.
"I'm sorry, Giovanni."
"I have to do this. I have to find out who I really am." Giovanni's shoulders slumped, and for a moment Helen thought he might argue further. But then he nodded, his eyes filled with sadness. "I understand," he said quietly. "But just know, whatever you decide, I'll be here for you. I'll always be here." Helen nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she turned away. She needed time, space to sort through the tangled web of emotions and memories that had suddenly taken over her life. She knew that finding the truth might come at a cost, but it was a journey she had to take, alone. The next morning, Helen left a note for Giovanni, explaining that she needed time to think and would be staying in a small village outside of Florence for a few days. She didn't know what she would find, but she hoped the solitude would help her sort through the confusion in her mind. As she boarded the train, Helen glanced back at the city that had been her home for so long. It had been a place of healing, a place where she had found love and purpose. But now, it was also a place of secrets, a place where her true identity had been hidden from her. The train pulled away, and with it, Helen felt a sense of both loss and anticipation. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she was determined to face it, to uncover the truth about her past, no matter what it might reveal. The small village of San Gimignano, nestled in the Tuscan hills, was a world away from the bustling streets of Florence. As Helen stepped off the train, The peacefulness of the place enveloped her like a comforting embrace. The stone-paved streets were quiet, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh bread from the local bakery. It was exactly the kind of place she needed to clear her mind and confront the shadows of her past. Helen checked into a modest inn on the edge of the village, the kind of place where no one asked too many questions. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a kind smile, handed Helen a key and showed her to a simple, sunlit room with a view of the rolling hills. As soon as she was alone, Helen sat by the window, the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her. She pulled out a small notebook she had brought with her, flipping through the blank pages. It was time to start making sense of the fragmented memories that had been haunting her. Taking a deep breath, she began to write down everything she could remember. Every flash, every image, every feeling that seemed to come from a life she didn't fully recognize. The more she wrote, the more the memories seemed to take shape. She remembered a small house in a quiet neighborhood, a garden with roses, and a man's face, Harold's face, smiling at her. She remembered laughter, conversations over breakfast, and a sense of belonging that felt both comforting and distant. And then there were darker memories, the screech of tires, the impact of metal, and the overwhelming pain that had followed. But one memory stood out above all others: her wedding day. She saw herself in a white dress, standing next to Harold, their hands clasped together as they exchanged vows. The memory was so vivid, so real, that tears welled up in her eyes. How could she have forgotten something so important? How could she have forgotten him? As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Helen knew she couldn't stay in San Gimignano forever. She had to go back to Florence, to confront Giovanni with what she had discovered. She needed to know how much he knew and why he had kept the truth from her for so long. The next morning, Helen returned to Florence with a newfound resolve. She arrived at her apartment to find Giovanni waiting for her, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. The moment she stepped inside, he could tell that something had changed. "Helen," Giovanni began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. "No more lies, no more half-truths. I need to know everything." Giovanni sighed, running a hand through his hair as he gestured for her to sit. "I was afraid this day would come," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. Helen remained standing, her eyes fixed on him. "Just tell me the truth, Giovanni. Who am I really?" Giovanni looked at her, his eyes filled with sadness. "You're Eleanor Thompson. I didn't know at first, but when you started to remember things, I realized who you were." Helen's breath caught in her throat. Hearing it from Giovanni made it all the more real. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me live this lie?" Giovanni's face was etched with pain. "Because I was selfish, Helen. I was afraid that if you remembered, you would leave me. I didn't want to lose you." Helen's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You should have told me the truth. You had no right to keep this from me." Giovanni nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, and I'm sorry, but I was so afraid of losing you that I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. I wanted to protect you from the pain of your past." "But it's my past," Helen said, her voice breaking. "You had no right to decide that for me." Giovanni stood, crossing the room to stand in front of her. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But Helen, please believe me when I say that I love you. Everything I did because I love you." Helen looked into Giovanni's eyes, seeing the truth in his words, but it didn't change the fact that he had lied to her, had taken away her chance to remember who she really was. "I can't stay here, Giovanni," she said softly. "I need to go back to New York, to the life I had before. I need to find out if I can still be Eleanor." Giovanni's face crumpled with despair, but he nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I understand. But just know, no matter what you decide, I'll always love you." Helen nodded, tears streaming down her face as she turned to leave. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back at the man who had been both her savior and her captor. "Goodbye, Giovanni," she whispered, and with that, she walked out of the apartment, closing the door on that chapter of her life. As she stepped onto the street, Helen felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. She was leaving behind the life she had known as Helen Porter, but she was finally beginning to reclaim the life she had lost as Eleanor Thompson. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Helen felt like she was heading in the right direction. And so, with a heart full of fear and hope, Helen set out on the path to rediscover who she really was, knowing that the journey would be long and difficult, but that it was a journey she had to take, no matter the cost. The plane touched down in New York under a gray, overcast sky, matching the uncertainty swirling in Helen's mind. As she stepped off the aircraft and into the bustling terminal, the familiarity of her surroundings was both comforting and unsettling. It had been years since she'd been here, or so it felt. The memories of her life as Eleanor were still fragmented, but the sense of belonging to this place was undeniable. Harold was waiting for her at the arrival gate. When their eyes met, Helen saw a mix of hope, fear, and an unmistakable love in his expression. He approached her slowly, as if afraid she might disappear again. "Eleanor," Harold said softly, the name hanging in the air like a fragile thread connecting them. "Harold," she replied, her voice trembling with the weight of everything that had happened. She wasn't sure if she was ready to be Eleanor again, but seeing Harold, she knew she couldn't keep running from the past. They walked in silence to the parking lot, where Harold had parked his car. The drive to his house was quiet, filled with an unspoken tension. Helen stared out the window, the city passing by in a blur. She felt like a stranger in her own life, torn between two identities, one that she was slowly reclaiming and another she had built from scratch. When they arrived at Harold's house, memories hit her in waves. The small garden in the front yard, the porch swing where she and Harold used to sit on warm summer evenings, it all felt both familiar and foreign. Harold led her inside, where the scent of old wood and roses brought back flashes of their life together. "I kept everything just the way it was," Harold said quietly as they stepped into the living room. "I couldn't bring myself to change anything." Helen looked around, taking in the photos on the walls, the books on the shelves, the worn sofa where they had spent countless evenings together. It was like stepping back in time, but she wasn't sure if she belonged here anymore. "Do you remember any of this?" Harold asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and fear. Helen nodded slowly, but her expression was conflicted. "I remember pieces. It's like a dream, hazy and out of reach. But it feels real." Harold smiled sadly, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to force it, Eleanor. I know this is all overwhelming. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'll wait as long as it takes for you to remember." Helen felt a pang of guilt. Harold had waited for her for so long, clinging to the hope that she would come back to him. But now that she was here, she wasn't sure if she could be the woman he remembered. The years in Florence had changed her, and the person she had become as Helen Porter was still very much a part of her. They spent the next few days together, revisiting places that had once been important to them. Harold took her to their favorite cafe, the park where they used to walk, and even the old theater where they had gone on their first date. Each place brought back more memories, But with them came the realization that she wasn't the same person she had been before the accident. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, Harold finally asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Eleanor, do you think you can stay? Do you think we can start again?" Helen's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She wanted to say yes, to tell him that they could pick up where they left off, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't know, Harold," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've changed. The years in Florence, they made me someone different. I don't know if I can go back to being the Eleanor you remember." Harold nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the pain of her words. "I understand. I missed you so much. I held on to the hope that you'd come back to me, and now that you're here, I'm afraid of losing you again." Helen took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You haven't lost me, Harold, but I think we both need to accept that things can't go back to the way they were. We've both changed." Tears welled up in Harold's eyes, and he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want you to be happy, Eleanor, whether that's with me or somewhere else." Helen's heart broke at the thought of leaving him again, but she knew she had to be honest with herself, and with Harold. "I don't know where my place is yet, but I need to find out. I need to figure out who I am now, and what that means for both of us." Harold pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if afraid she might disappear. "I'll always love you, Eleanor, no matter what you decide." Helen rested her head against his shoulder, tears streaming down her face. She knew this was one of the hardest decisions she would ever have to make, but it was one she couldn't avoid. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. Now she had to decide what kind of future she wanted, whether it was with Harold as Eleanor Thompson or on her own as someone new. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the porch, Helen knew that the time had come to make her choice. And whatever that choice was, it would change her life, and Harold's, forever. Several months had passed since Helen made her decision, and the seasons had shifted from the warmth of summer to the crispness of autumn. The trees in New York had begun to shed their leaves, blanketing the ground in shades of red, orange, and gold. Helen stood at the window of her small apartment, watching the leaves drift by, a gentle reminder of the passage of time. After that evening on the porch with Harold, she had spent weeks reflecting on her life, both as Eleanor and as Helen. The memories had continued to resurface, some vivid and clear, others still shrouded in mist. But the more she remembered, the more she realized that she couldn't simply step back into her old life. Too much had changed. She had changed. It was a painful realization, but also a liberating one. For the first time since the accident, Helen felt like she was in control of her own destiny. She had chosen to stay in New York, but not as Eleanor Thompson. Instead, she had decided to embrace the person she had become, a blend of both Eleanor and Helen, someone who carried the experiences and emotions of both lives. Harold had been heartbroken by her decision, but he had understood. He had always known that the woman he loved had changed, and that trying to force her back into the life they once had would only cause more pain. They had parted ways on good terms, with a promise to stay in touch, but with the understanding that they both needed time to heal and move forward. Helen had found a job in a small bookstore near her apartment, a place where she could lose herself in the quiet comfort of books while she continued to piece together her identity. The days were peaceful, if a bit lonely, but Helen found solace in the routine. She had begun to write again, filling notebooks with her thoughts and memories, trying to make sense of the woman she had become. One day, as she was organizing a shelf of old novels, the bell above the bookstore door chimed, signaling the arrival of a customer. Helen looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Giovanni. He stood in the doorway, looking as dashing as ever, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He smiled at her, and Helen couldn't help but smile back, though her heart raced with a mix of emotions. "Giovanni," she said, her voice filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see you," he replied, stepping further into the store. "I was in New York for business, and I thought it would be nice to see an old friend." Helen's smile widened, and she nodded, gesturing for him to join her in the small reading nook at the back of the store. They sat together, the silence between them comfortable, yet charged with the unspoken words of their past. "I've missed you," Giovanni admitted, his voice soft. "But I understand why you had to leave. I'm glad you're finding your way." Helen looked down at her hands, then back up at Giovanni. "I've missed you too, Giovanni. You were a big part of my life, and I'll always be grateful for what you did for me." Giovanni nodded, his expression tinged with sadness. "I only wish I could have done things differently, but I'm happy to see that you're doing well." Helen smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you. And what about you? How are things in Florence?" Giovanni leaned back, a hint of a smile on his lips. "They're good. The gallery is thriving, and I've been doing a lot of thinking too. I've realized that sometimes loving someone means letting them go." Helen reached out and took Giovanni's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You were a good man to me, Giovanni, and I'm glad we had the time we did together." Giovanni squeezed her hand in return, then released it, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that touched her heart. "I wish you all the happiness in the world, Helen. Or should I say Eleanor?" Helen shook her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "Just Helen is fine. I think I've finally made peace with who I am, and who I was." Giovanni smiled, and for the first time since they had parted, Helen felt a sense of closure, a feeling that everything was finally where it was supposed to be. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, reminiscing about the past and sharing hopes for the future. When it was time for Giovanni to leave, they hugged, a gentle farewell between two people who had once meant the world to each other. As Giovanni walked out of the bookstore and into the busy streets of New York, Helen felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made the right decision, and though the road had been long and difficult, she had finally found herself. She was neither just Eleanor nor just Helen. She was both, and more. She was a survivor, a woman who had faced her past and come out stronger on the other side. And as she stood there, watching the world go by outside the window, Helen knew that her story was far from over. It was just beginning, and whatever came next, she was ready to face it with courage and an open heart. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 5 to let us know how much you like the story. Also watch the video that is currently on your screen. See you soon.